Okay, hello world. So my name is Allie Jones and I'm Executive Director of Teachers to Teachers Global. Our mission is to build quality math education programs through collaborative partnerships that drive greater social justice. Thank you for joining us today for our third live chat on math for anti-racism. These conversations are important to me personally because I think math class is where we can build the emotional skill set needed to practice anti-racism in daily life. I'm passionate about quality math education because it's where we can build both the critical thinking skills and the courage needed to succeed and not give up when things get hard. Great math teachers create spaces where their students can see multiple ways of solving the same problem and experience the benefits of collaboration firsthand. They recognize their students as full people and build environments that respond to their unique needs. As we become an increasingly connected global community, I think the topic of culturally responsive pedagogy and mathematics education is particularly important. I'd like to introduce Dr. Shelly M. Jones, who is a professor of mathematics education at Central Connecticut State University, as well as president-elect of the Benjamin Banneker Association, a national organization that advocates for excellence in teaching and learning for African American children. With over 25 years experience as an educator, her courses in mathematics content, curriculum, and methods are offered to pre-service and practicing teachers. Her interest in equity issues led her most recently to write and publish a children's activity book, Women Who Count, honoring African American women mathematicians, highlighting the important contributions of 29 African American women in mathematics. Dr. Jones has made 3 trips to the field with T2T Global to work with math teachers in vulnerable communities in Ecuador. She has led a study abroad trip to teach in Ghana and with a group of pre-service teachers from CCSU and community members from Connecticut and New York. Dr. Jones's Math for Anti-Racism stance centers on teaching culturally relevant mathematics, as well as her recent work on NCSM's position paper on detracking mathematics. So, Shelly, just want to mention too, that's, I think, your book cover behind you. So thank you so much for joining us today. And before we jump into questions, I just wanted to give you space to share anything. We're just so excited to have you.
Well, thank you so much. First, Allie, I thank you. I thank Chad and Jenny. You all know I love Teachers to Teacher. Like you said, I've been on several trips with you. And I just think it's a wonderful idea what you all do, professional development in math and science. But in all that you do, you make sure to keep the local culture and community involved. You're working with the people in the community. You're not going there to tell them, oh, this is the better way. Instead, you're looking at the cultural context and you're working with the teachers there and as well with the students. So we work with the teachers and the students in the different locations that we go. And I also wanted to say, Suhaila, I just wanted to make sure I said her name right. Thank you for Suhaila as well for helping out with all the tech.
Yeah, great, awesome. That is a great place to start from because I think the idea of doing things with a community is so important. And we think about that a lot in the classroom, right? So this first question that we have is, why do the cultural backgrounds of students matter in math class? The way that I kind of approach it is that in order to really achieve anything with anyone as a team, you have to understand what other people are bringing into the room and their lived experiences and their perspectives. And so that might shape how you communicate with each other. So what do you think about why the cultural backgrounds of students matter in math?
Well, absolutely. I think the cultural backgrounds of students matter. You know, students come into our classrooms as whole people. Let's just think about it. When students are young, when they're little children, they mimic their parents, right? So they come in with a culture already. Students learn from what they see and what they do, right? And so in our math textbooks, in the context that we choose, if we only choose context from a white cultural background, the students don't see themselves in the math classroom. I have a colleague, Georgina Rivera, and she told a story about how she never saw herself or she never saw her culture represented in her schooling, right? K to 12. It wasn't until she was a graduate student and she is a math administrator in a school district. And she took a class and we talked about culturally relevant pedagogy. And she could not believe that she was just hearing about this for the first time. And she said to herself, wow, now I understand what I was missing back then as a student. In fact, she said that not only was her culture not represented, but when it was represented, it was in a negative way. And she said that she almost cowered down when she heard some of the things that were being said about her culture. I like to look at it from a window and a mirror perspective, mirrors and windows, right? A mirror is, we want some of the context, we want some of the information that's being learned, actually that's going back and forth, because we don't want it to just be from the teacher to the student, but that's being discussed in the classroom. We want students to see themselves in some of that, right? Some of the context, some of the culture, we want them to see themselves. That's the mirror. Whereas with the window, yes, sure, we want them to learn some historical perspectives of math. We want them to learn about other cultures. But if they only see one culture, or they mostly see that one dominant culture, they're going to think, well, this is the right way, and this is the other way. So they become others. And so that's why culture is so important in the mathematics classrooms. It's important in every classroom, but the reason why we talk about it in the math classroom right now is because math is one of those subjects that we've learned or we have thought was neutral. We would say, oh, when kids come from Ecuador into our classrooms, oh, the math part will be easy because math is universal. And we learned that, well, no, not really, right? I don't know if it was last week, but Dr. Arthur Powell talked about how the number 2 means 2 because we've learned English and we understand that 2 means these 2 things. Or if I have a cell phone and a water bottle. So that abstract concept about 2 is because we've learned that 2 means these things, right? It could be called something else in a different culture. It could be something else if we're talking about a different base. And so math is so cultural. I mean, it really blows my mind the more and more I learn about it, because we're lifelong learners. And so that's how and why I think math is important. Culture is important in the math classroom.
Mm-hmm. I reflect a lot on an experience I had at one point a few years ago when I was working in Guatemala. And right when I first got there, my team, I was looking at some papers that my team had been working on, and none of the numbers were squaring for me. Like the just didn't make sense. Mm-hmm. And so when I went and had a conversation with them, I realized that the 7 and the 1, right, like are written differently in Guatemala than they are in the United States. And so I had been looking at a representation of a 1 and thinking it was a 7. And so a lot of assumptions could potentially be made in that moment if you don't take the time to have that conversation, or you haven't had the exposure to that kind of cultural awareness and knowledge that even something as little as that can really shift the dynamics and power dynamics in relationships.
Yeah, and I think also by having that mirror view, students are able to develop a positive math identity. Because just think about it, if you never see yourself in the mathematics, most of the times you're feeling like, oh, well, I'm not really a math person. I don't really see myself. And that's why representation matters. So we have representation in mathematics. We have the cultural context of the community. There's so much involved in math, in math and culture, that interaction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it reinforces the influence of a teacher in those moments in a classroom, and how a teacher responds, and how important those choices are in that moment, and the long-term impact that can have on a student for how a teacher reacts. Mm-hmm. So what are some real life examples about how culturally relevant pedagogy might look different in action between classrooms? Or I think sometimes in these conversations we can get really up here, and just like when we are working with professional development with teachers, we always want to bring it back to those real life examples and make it feel as tangible as possible for everybody. So I know you have a tons of real life experience from working with your students.
Sure. So, it begins by, first of all, learning about your students, talking to your students, and you know what? Learning about their community, learning about, someone called it the 4 H's in a dissertation I read, their home life, their heritage, their hobbies, their hopes. I mean, imagine a math class that looks at, what do these students really want? What do they hope for, right? What do they aspire to be? How do they even know to aspire to be that, right? We talked a little bit about the hidden figures, and I talked about how representation matters. So when teachers are choosing a context, or even a mathematician, right? A lot of times when we say mathematician, someone might think of Einstein or Fermat or Euler. Now we're starting to think of Benjamin Banneker and Katherine Johnson. So representation matters. I was watching TV this morning, and on the Today Show, they had 3 students. I don't know the ages, maybe between age 10 and 13. And they were authors and bloggers and entrepreneurs at that age. And I can't believe the wisdom that came out of these young students. One said, the reason why I wrote this book is because I didn't see myself in any of the books I read. That was a young African-American girl. And then an African-American boy said, I feel empowered when I see the main character that looks like me. And so he wrote a book with himself as the main character. And so that's how we bring students in to the mathematics classroom. Now, in terms of just examples, there are actually many examples out there. For instance, if you look at some of the literature in culturally relevant and culturally responsive math, what you'll see is someone like Turner and Font Strawhorn. They actually ask the students, what are some issues that concern you or that you're interested in, either about your school or your community? And the students had some time, and it was time well spent, to just talk about some things that they wanted to know more about or wanted to learn more about, or maybe it was an issue, right? Maybe a social justice issue. And maybe the students didn't use those words, social justice, but what came out of it was overcrowding of their school. And so they were in a school building where one floor was their school and another floor was another school. And they noticed that the other school didn't have overcrowding. And so when they were able to give the students, the teacher and the researcher chose overcrowding out of all of the other topics, because the overcrowding of the school got at one of the math standards for their grade level, and it was area and perimeter. So they were able to use a context that came from the students, but still cover the content, right? And so one student they talked about, they named her Angel in the paper. She was very excited. And although she didn't hate math, she says, oh, math's okay. It's not my best subject. I prefer, reading and writing poetry. She says, but math is just not my thing. I don't hate it, but it's not my thing. But Angel ended up being one of the students that led one of the groups, because she says whenever she went to the girls' bathroom, she could never get there, do what she needed to do, and get back to class on time. So she wanted to find out, the spacing in the bathroom. And so they went into the bathroom and they measured the area and perimeter, and they looked at some things there. So the teachers were able to still cover the content, which is what most teachers feel pressured to do, but at the same time, something that a student that isn't normally really actively engaged was actively engaged. So that's just a really small example. And there's examples of even all the way to from pre-K up. So a lot of times people think, oh, culturally relevant, we can't do that with kindergarten students. And in fact, they did. They talked about Rosa Parks, and they did a little reenactment. It was Chow and Jones. They did a reenactment, and the kids got on the bus, and then they asked some kids to get off. And then when the kids got off, they had to give them their penny back. And they were counting as they got on, they put the penny in the bank. As they got off, they took their penny back. And so they were counting up and counting back. And it was really a simple thing for pre-K, but it still got at some historical references that even young children might have heard about Rosa Parks. Well, who is she? What did she do? And so even at that age, they were learning about Rosa Parks and learning about getting on the bus and getting off the bus. Something at their grade level, but at the same time, a social justice issue. Mm-hmm. So those are just some examples.
Those are great examples. And I think one of the things that stands out to me in those examples is like the connection between class and real life, right? Is that they're, at least in my experience in school, I remember there being a little bit too much of a disconnect, and there was always stuff going on in the news, and we would talk about stuff at the dinner table, but that's the stuff I wanted to talk about in class and dig into a discussion with. And I think that's the opportunity that we have in math class now, is to bring more of the real world into the classroom, to be able to understand more of the real world with the tools that we can build in class.
That's a great way to start asking students, what did you talk about at the dinner table? I worked with middle school students this summer, and part of the program was, we ordered materials for them. So I ordered cameras. I can't remember what you call them, but the cameras where you take the picture and it comes right out into something. But anyway, so I know they have phones, but I wanted something different. And so I asked them, go into your community and take 2 to 3 pictures and bring them back. But you have to take pictures that show math. Where's the math in your community? And students brought back some interesting things. Some of the things are things that we would just ordinarily think about. But as the teacher, you can bump up that level of math. We had a student that took a picture of her fireplace and showed the patterns of the bricks. And we could talk about tessellations. We had a student that said, this is the biggest tree in my neighborhood and there's a swing on it. So we talked about pendulums. You can talk about the growth of tree. You can talk about indirect measurement. You're not going to climb the tree to measurement, but you can measure the shadow, then measure your shadow and use a proportion to figure out the height of the tree. And so there's these great things that you can do with math right in the students' communities. And it comes right from them. Aiden talked about his grandfather's garden and took a picture of it. And it was beautiful. It was like the rows in the columns were beautiful. And we talked about multiplication using arrays. And you can talk about the distributive property. So there's a lot of things that you can get just from the students. Usually the math that they tell you is usually a very basic level, but then you can heighten that level. Romesa talked about the patterns in her couch. And I said, wow, those are Islamic patterns, because she, showed the picture. And she had earlier talked about she was a Muslim, and how one of the words we had them choose hashtags. What's a hashtag that would represent you? And she said something like honor or something like that. And just from those small things, I'm able to surmise, okay, these are Islamic tessellations. Let's talk about that. And all of a sudden, she realizes that there's this word for this couch pattern that she's been sitting on. So those are some other examples.
Yeah, and it's an opportunity to celebrate it, right? And to create a moment where you're celebrating that part of culture with other students in the classroom as well. And yeah, acknowledging and seeing everybody for their full person.
Absolutely. In the chat, when Ramesa said she was a Muslim, in the chat, someone else like, I'm a Muslim. And it was just like an instant connection for them. And it was just really endearing. And we just learn so much when we give them a chance to talk. And I know teachers do this already, but a lot of times they're not doing it in math. They're doing it in other places in the curriculum, but we need to connect it to math. I think that's where the thing I want to make clear is, I'm not saying that teachers don't already do some of these things. They don't already learn about their students, but a lot of teachers are not connecting it to math yet because they didn't know they needed to. You know, they thought, well, math is math. I have this curriculum, I'm going to use it. You know, one part of the culturally relevant pedagogy I really want to mention and stress is that there's a critical component to it, right? So there's culturally responsive and culturally relevant. And I tend to use culturally relevant just because that's one of the, there's a part of it that I like that sort of gets at social justice, right? So the culturally relevant, Gloria Ladson-Billings coined the term, and she says, well, the students have to achieve academically. So we're not going to choose a context that's a third grade context when I'm teaching sixth graders. So we still want it to be cognitively demanding. Students should, if they're in a situation where the teacher is teaching from a culturally relevant perspective, students should become culturally, have cultural competence. They should be learning about themselves. A lot of students don't even know about themselves and their own cultures. They don't know they have a culture, and they should learn about others. But last but not least, they should be ready to critique the social order because they already know some things are not fair. They don't know why. They don't know what they can do about it. And some teachers are afraid that, well, if I'm teaching elementary, isn't that too heavy? No. Don't you think if kids are experiencing heavy in their neighborhoods and at home, why can't we, they're going to experience the heavy, but we're going to help them to see that there are some things that you can do about it. There's some people who you can write. You can write to your the politicians or your councils in your towns. So we're not going to introduce anything that's so heavy that they leave without some type of answer. But it doesn't also mean that you're going to get an answer in 45 minutes. You know. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's a way for them to discuss things that they're already thinking about because they see it and they hear about it. They see it on TV, on the internet, whatever they watch, probably not TV, but on the internet, and they hear about it at the dinner table. There's not a kid that hasn't heard about George Floyd, right? There's not. And so if we don't talk about it, then we're not doing the math justice, social mm-hmm. justice.
Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that be an amazing skill set to have in a generation of students, right? The ability to acknowledge that something is going to be hard and we can still dig into it and explore it and wrestle with it and still acknowledge that it's really hard, but that we're all doing it together and that by doing it together, we can achieve it. I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I ruminate on that idea a lot because the world feels very hard right now for all of us, especially in light of COVID. And I think that the ability to confront our failures and to acknowledge them and talk about them and explore solutions with other people is what can really change the world. And so that's a big part of math class, right? Like that skill is, I think, what we can build in students in that space. And it does take a village, right? Like parents, administrators, teachers, mm-hmm. we all have a role in it. But that experience in the classroom is such a special opportunity for kids to develop that mm-hmm. that knowledge, that feel it for themselves.
Sure.
And
sure. Yeah, and I think as teachers, as educators, we just have to talk with each other. We just have to ask about others' experiences. We're not going to know it all. Like I'm still learning this last month or two, I've gone to so many webinars, but they've been wonderful because it's an opportunity for me to learn because I don't know a lot. I was looking at, someone posted on Facebook a map. I don't know if it was a census map, but it was a map of the languages in the United States that are commonly spoken at home. So besides English and Spanish. So they say, okay, those two languages we know. What other languages are spoken at home? And, you know, I was just surprised at some of the languages. They had Somali, I think that was in Minnesota. And then they had Arabic. That was in, I think, Michigan. And then they had Vietnamese in Texas. In Connecticut, they have Portuguese. And I know a lot of Portuguese people, but I would not have thought that Portuguese would be the third. They have English, Spanish, and then Portuguese. And the administrator that I was talking about that told her story is Portuguese. So I just thought, wow, so I need to learn more about the Portuguese culture. You know, my father, I remember, talked about growing up with a lot of Portuguese people in Bridgeport, Connecticut. But I never really learned about the culture. You know, you have these silos and you kind of stay in your silos. And I think school and classrooms are a place where, especially these days, where that kids are learning from each other. I tell you, the kids are learning from each other. Like, even if the adults in the room aren't, the kids are. They know how to pronounce the names. They're not having trouble like we are. You know, they know how to pronounce the names. They know what kids like. They know what their families are like. And so I think that we just need to take the lead from them.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't agree more. So what kinds of things might become possible for the world if all students had access to quality math education and could have this amazing experience in math class?
Yeah. Well, you know, I talked a lot about the context of math, right? I talked about students knowing their history, right? Historical references, other mathematicians, representation matters, seeing that math is more diverse, right, than white males, right, than European males. So those are all things that we need to do. But I didn't talk much about the classroom culture because that's a big part of it, right? So in our classroom cultures, you know that there's always this one or two students that everyone knows they're the smart kids in the math class. They're the go-tos. They're going to answer the questions first. So I really don't have to raise my hand because I know Shelly's going to answer that question. But what that helps students to learn is that math is fast, and it's not. Students need to learn that math. How do mathematicians work? It could take them hours, weeks, years to solve one math problem. Students need to know that. Students need to know that mathematicians make mistakes. Students need to know that there's more to math than just what you put on a worksheet, right? They need to know that their community is doing math every day. They need to know that when grandma makes her doilies, when my mom crochets or knits, she's doing math. In fact, my mother always calls me to tell me or texts me to tell me about the math that she's doing because I always point it out to her. And now when she listens to her YouTube videos about knitting or she's learning a new stitch, she's like, oh my goodness, look at all the math. And then she calls me to tell me about it. Marta Sybil, she's a mathematician and or math educator. It's hard for me because I don't know, do people consider themselves math educators, mathematicians? I mean, I guess could all be mathematicians, and students need to know or even see themselves as doers of math and as mathematicians. So if we can accomplish that, that would be a great thing because we all know that when we talk to students, many students say, I'm not good at math or I'm not a math person. They would never say I'm not a good reader, you know, but there was a nurse, I had a poster presentation and she comes up to it and she says, oh, I'm not good at math. And I looked at her, I said, you better be good at math. You're a nurse. And she said, oh, no, not that. I was like, yes, that's math. Like, don't say you're not good at math. If you're an interior designer, you're good at math. And you hear from people that they're not good at math because they think math is this, you know, thing that they do on paper or something that they have to memorize and then, you know, scratch it back on a piece of paper or answer a solution with a certain, you have to have the right answer and it has to be in the right format rather than there could be more than one answer, right? So I started to talk about Marta Sybil and she's, I think in Arizona, I think, maybe New Mexico, somewhere in the Southwest. And she meets with the community, moms, and they do their doilies. That's where I brought up doilies. And she talks to them about the math that's involved. Because then their students, their children begin to see that mom or grandma, she's smart. Because I'm going to tell you, a lot of students, they don't think their parents are necessarily smart, not in math. because they can't do math the way the teacher does it. A lot of parents say, oh, I can't do this Common Core math. And they're probably right, because they're thinking that they have to do it the way they were taught rather than how would you do it as an adult? I bet it's closer to what people are calling Common Core math, which is just math in a more conceptual way. Because a lot of the math that we do in classrooms, or we used to do, is memorization, it's shortcuts, right? So, you know, we add 5 and 6 is 11. We put the 1 here and we carry the 1. No, that's not a 1. That's a 10. We made a 10 and then we had 1 left over. So let's say it that way, right? And so I think that for the for the world to be a better place, I think that we need to come to grips with math anxiety, math trauma. Their kids are traumatized. There are a lot of kids that are traumatized in math when they get, and I'm talking about in 2020, when I get students in the pre-service teachers, they're college students. Some of them still have math anxiety. And we talk about that first. We don't get straight to the math, because if you can't break through that anxiety, you're not going to do the math. Mm-hmm. You need to find out what's their math history. What's your math story? I call it the math autobiography. And they write it, and they can always remember either a teacher that made them feel good or a teacher that didn't. A lot of times they don't remember what the math was, but they just knew, they remember how they felt. Maya Angelou. You remember how someone makes you feel. And so if we can start with the kid and looking at that student as a person, as a whole person, that is good at something, right? They might not be good at the math in front of them, but they're good at something. I had a student in 8th grade, Larry, and I didn't know it, but he was an artist. I just knew that he sat in the back of the room. And I kind of like had a little thing with Larry, like, why, you know, what's wrong with my math lesson? Why isn't he paying attention? But I went back one day and he was doodling, but his doodling was like art. It was like, whoa, you did that freehand? Yeah, miss. And so I got Larry to do we were doing proportions or something. And he took a snake out of the newspaper. It was a comic strip, and he enlarged it to fit on our classroom door. And he led that project. So if you can tap into that, that's what we want. And one more thing, Francis Sue has a book, Math for Human Flourishing. And I say these names because this is how I learn, right? We learn from each other. I learn from Francis. Francis might learn something from me, right? So he talks about the beauty of math. And I guarantee you, at least half the people you ask about math, probably more than half, I'm being generous, will not describe math as beautiful, right? Beautiful mind, right? But if we can get students to see the beauty in math, like there's nothing I cannot look at. I know my family gets tired of it. There's nothing I can look at and not think of math, because there's math everywhere. I mean, every single thing, the book, The Math Curse. And so I think we need to not only see the utility of math, but see the beauty of math and just really experience math, you know, like as a puzzle, you know, as something and you know, kids need to understand and know that they could actually create math. You know, there are kids creating codes, right, for computer programming and things like that. That's math. That's mathematical. And so if they like to play those games and do codes, they're really doing math, because they're using flow charts, they're repeating algorithms. And so there's so much math there. If we just let students know, you're doing math, you're a mathematician. One
let
more
them
thing.
see their own power. Yeah.
That was the last thing. One more thing. When we have people sit down together and from different cultures, we get so much more out of it, right? I thought about, I don't know if it was Mae Jemison, but there was this story about how, you know, mastectomies used to be, you know, what we went to, the go-to thing when women had breast cancer, right? But when women became involved in that, all of a sudden, that was no longer, that was not the first go-to thing, because women began to help the men in the field understand that, wait, let's ask some more questions. What else can we do? And so when you have diverse voices, I've been in meetings where I was like, whoa, you know, let me suggest this. Because if you don't have those diverse voices, you're going to be closed off to some wonderful ideas. And so that's what we need, more diverse voices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the exciting things about math class is that it's the chance to show kids that there's value in that, so that when they go out into the workplace and are hiring people for a team or building a company as an entrepreneur or anything like that, they are thinking in that way and looking at candidates who are going to ask them questions that they know they wouldn't think to ask themselves, and intentionally creating and curating a really diverse environment because they know it's the key for success. So we are just about out of time for today. And before we head out, I definitely wanted to ask you, where can we find your book?
Oh, let's see. On the AMS, American Mathematical Society, the AMS bookstore. So there's a website, ams.org, and you go to the bookstore. You can also find it on Amazon. And then I actually have a website, www.womenwhocount.net. So not only can you purchase the book there, but you can see lots of the work that I've been doing around culturally relevant pedagogy and around the book, the hidden figures. And in addition to the hidden figures, we have the first 3 women, African-American women to earn PhDs in math. Then we have what I call the pioneers. And then we have the unhidden figures, including Christine Darden. She wasn't in the movie, but she was in the book. And then we have the contemporary first. Because in 2020, we still have first. For instance, I'm the first African-American to earn full professorship in my math department. And so we are still making first. And Mary Jackson in Hidden Figures in the movie talked about how making first and having students see that we're still making first, you could be the first at something. They need to know that. So they can be creative, they can be innovative, they can do all that with math. What I love about the contemporary mathematicians is they have all types of careers. Sometimes they think, oh, if you're going to do math, then you're just going to do A or B. You know, you're going to be a teacher or going to do this. Well, no, there's all types of careers that they can have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. This is so inspiring. So grateful to have you in our community, and wish you the best of luck. So talk to you later, Shelly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allie. Bye-bye.